Good morning, church. Oh, you're awake. That's great. So glad to be with you this morning. I know I'm still getting to know you, and you're still getting to know me, so I thought I would tell you a little something about myself. Years ago, clearly before I broke my ankle, I got into running and discovered the joy of running. Do we have any runners or former runners out there? A few, maybe former, maybe more former than current. Yeah. So when I was really amping up into running and trying to become a runner, I just did a lot of running on my treadmill in my neighborhood, and I had a friend who was a for real runner, and he recommended that in order to motivate myself to become a better runner, I register for a 5K. So I registered for my first race, and leading up to the race, I did all of the training. I downloaded a little training schedule, and I did all of that kind of stuff on my treadmill. And the day of the race came, and I got to the race, and I started looking around, and I started thinking, what did I get myself into? Because I looked around, and there was the for real runners there who had the fancy shoes, and you could tell that they did this almost every weekend, and they were there to win the medal. Those runners were there. And I started to feel a little intimidated, but I thought, okay, that's okay. I got this, I've trained. So the gun went off, and the race began, and I just took off like my little normal self and realized maybe 1 mile into the 3 miles that, maybe I should have trained on sidewalk instead of on a treadmill. Because this is feeling much harder than everything I did. And I thought, but it's a mile. I've got a mile done. Okay, I can get there. And then mile 2 hit. And I still had another 1 point something miles to go. And it really started to get to me. I was feeling like all of my body said, "What have you done to us today?" And I was not prepared for the pounding of the sidewalk or the hills or the curves. And my body began to rebel. And it was not ready for this race. And it began to get so hard. My thighs were burning, and my feet were aching, and my lungs were on fire. And I thought, I don't know if I can even finish this. And I hit mile 2 and 2.5 and 3, and there was just a little bit left. And I thought, why am I here? I don't know what I was thinking. I am not a runner. Michelle, never do this again. I don't know if I will even ever see civilization again. Will I just fall over right here in the middle of the woods? I don't know. And I was really beginning to panic, and I felt like maybe quitting. And then I came around a corner, and up ahead I could see someone was waiting for me. And my friend, who had encouraged me to join this 5K, had already finished the race. And I thought, good for you. I was doubting that I could make it to the end because I was in so much pain. Everything was screaming in me, this is stupid, just quit. The Hebrew believers, I believe, were in a similar position. We've been in a series in the book of Hebrews for the last several weeks, and what we know about the book of Hebrews is that it was written to a group of followers of Jesus who were going through some intense pressure and persecution and difficulty, and they were fatigued, and they were discouraged, and they were questioning, Is this worth it? Can I keep going? Is it possible? What were we crazy to do this? And the author of Hebrews says, remember that Christ is who he says he is, that Jesus is a Savior worth believing in. Press on in faith, not because following Jesus is easy, but we press on because he is worth following. And we keep taking steps of faith to move forward because he is worth following. And he says who he says he is. He is. The writer of Hebrews wants us to understand that, wants the original readers to understand that, and he wants us to understand that. So by the time we reach chapter 11 of Hebrews, the author is exhorting us to choose faith in the midst of what can be discouraging and fatiguing and confusing. Now, choosing faith could be ambiguous. Faith is a word that we throw around pretty easily, and we use it in lots of different ways. Sometimes we throw it around as a spiritual platitude that just means your belief system. Sometimes we just mean it as like general optimism, like, having faith that something will happen, or be full of faith for that. But what we just generally mean is just be optimistic about that. Sometimes I've seen faith be misused and weaponized against one another. That's horrifying. But faith, because of this, is not necessarily easy to grasp. And so the author of Hebrews attempts to create a pictorial directory for us of what it looks like to have faith. And so that's what we heard this morning. References to creation and Abel and Moses and Joseph, and the stories that the original hearers of the book of Hebrews would have been very familiar with. They would have heard them since birth. And as the writer of Hebrews wants us to understand, to choose faith, he wanted to make clear what that looked like. It didn't just mean to be optimistic. He says, faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. So faith is not necessarily much clearer from that for me. So faith is being assured, but it's something you can't see. How do we be assured of something we can't see? Faith is certainty, but it's not a life of ease. Sometimes I think that in order to be certain, it has to feel easy. Faith is trust, but that means also you may not know what the outcome will be. And in these examples, we find out that the people of faith maybe never even saw the outcome of their faith. And the only thing we can really know by these stories is that faith is in a person, but not in faith itself. Sometimes we try to measure faith or the trustworthiness of faith, of believing in something, by how much I can muster up belief or strength or get it done, or be a faithful follower, like do the right thing. Then I'm a person of faith, right? But no, faith is not in faith itself. In fact, faith is also not in other people. Some of us have been disappointed and wounded by people, Christ followers. Our faith is not in people. It is in the person of God. It is in the person of Jesus. It is in the King of Kings. The writer of Hebrews said, remember who your faith is in. It's in Jesus, the one who is your high priest, who made it possible to get to God in the tabernacle. If you remember last week, we acted out the tabernacle, and we found out there were walls and curtains and all kinds of things that prevented us from seeing God. And Jesus was the one who made it possible to come all the way in and have access to God. He is the reason we can have faith. So, we have this photo album of what it actually looks like in real life. And I want to look at just one of those photos that we saw in Hebrews 11, and that's the photo of Abraham. We saw that in Abraham's story, in his example of what it looked like to have faith. Hang on a second. That he, first of all, obeyed God when he was asked to do something really hard. He set out for a place that was not his home. And he had to stay for a time there. And I want to point out that when we are living a life of faith, our life of faith is not antithetical to pain or discomfort. Sometimes we think if we are doing it all right, if we are following God and I'm holding up my end of the deal, then God should hold up his end of the deal and it should all just work out. Sometimes we talk about it like that, like it's an equation. But if you look at these examples of faith in Hebrews, every single example experienced pain and discomfort. Abraham was asked to leave his country and his people and his household, his relatives, and everything he knew. The food he was used to eating, the shelter he had for certain, the people who were his family, he was asked to leave them. He experienced famine on this journey. He experienced separation from his nephew, Lot. He had to watch a whole city be destroyed, and he grieved over that. He made massive mistakes. If we think of the story of Hagar and Ishmael, when Abraham was like, I'm supposed to have a kid, so maybe I'll just take this matter into my own hands. And that became a hot mess. Pain and discomfort. God asked if he would be even willing to give up his own son. And eventually, he buried his wife. He experienced loss and pain and waiting. Lots of waiting. I was recently reading a book that described, in the words of someone who grew up as a child of a missionary, this sentiment and this way that we think of faith as an equation and how that actually causes damage. And this is what the missionary kid said. To question pain was to question God. Pain and faith were antithetical. If someone had been able to accept my questions about why I felt so rotten, instead of speaking platitudes about God taking care of everything if you trust him, I might have found an easier way through those years. Instead, I ended up feeling that God was more than I was, and the pain didn't go away. And the lesson I learned was that you couldn't count on God. That is a very lonely place to be, not able to trust people or trust God. This is the effect of what happens when we think that having faith is going to be a comfortable life. And actually, what God invites us into is not ease and comfort, but it is full access to himself. It says that because Abraham considered him faithful who promised, he was willing to experience pain and discomfort. Because he considered him faithful, God does not invite us in a life of faith to be free from pain and discomfort, but he does offer us his full self. And so it should make us ask the question, is our faith conditional? Have I said to God, I am willing to follow you, Jesus, whenever and wherever and for the rest of my life, except if it's really hard, except if it's super painful, except if things happen that I don't understand, except if other followers of Jesus make me angry, except if I start to feel disillusioned about the church. Is our faith conditional? Because having a life of faith does not mean it won't be difficult. Abraham also shows us that his faith pushed him past his natural borders. So before God came to him and said, I want you to go, I have something I want you to do. In fact, if you do this, there will be an inheritance. But essentially, Abraham, I want you to be a blessing to the nations. I mean, this is an enormous thing God is inviting him into. And he leaves everything. And in order to do that, he had to step over his original boundaries. Because Abraham had a life before this. He had a family. Maybe he put a suit on every morning and went to work. Probably not a suit, but he had a purpose, he had a family, he had a daily rhythm, he had a place to live, he had, food that would be available to him, food he was familiar with. He had a language that he knew how to speak with his people. And God said, I want you to step over your natural boundary and come with me. We're going to go do this other thing, and it is going to be worth it. Abraham was willing to be pushed beyond his borders, and he describes living in a foreign land. Have you ever been in a situation where everything feels foreign? Maybe you don't speak the language where you're at. Maybe you're not used to the food you're eating or the people you don't know or maybe don't trust. Maybe you've been in a situation where you don't really know how people do things here. Maybe you've been asked to do something scary or risky, and you have to trust because you aren't inside of your comfortable borders anymore. I have a video clip that I thought of. Any Indiana Jones fans out there? Okay. Indiana Jones, if you are not familiar, was a movie series maybe in the 80s, I'd say. And Indiana Jones was an adventurer, and he went on scavenger hunts for ancient artifacts, and he always found himself solving puzzles and being in difficult situations. And so we have a video clip here of what I think risky faith might look like. There's that moment, right, where God asks us to take a risk and to trust who he really says he is. And we sweat, and we look around for another option, and we take a deep breath, and we put out our foot, and we take that first step, and we think, are you going to catch me, God? Is there something underneath this step? The reason we can take that step is because we can consider him faithful, who has promised to us who he is. And there is joy and freedom on the other side of that risk as we see God come through and really be who he really is. When we don't take risk in our faith life, we are sacrificing the opportunity to see who God is, to see that God is actually bigger than I give him credit for. And he wants you to know him in that way. So where might God be asking you to take risk? Does your faith have borders that you don't want to cross? Is there a first step you need to take? Maybe your first step is saying, I think I'm ready to follow Jesus. Maybe you've never taken that step before. Or maybe following Jesus was something that you used to do, and it's just sort of become numb, or rote, or routine. And Jesus is saying, I want you to start walking with me again. Maybe a step for you is baptism. A few weeks ago, it was so delightful to see one of our church members decide at the age of 90 to be baptized. It's never too late for that decision. Maybe for you, the risk is in your finances. Maybe you're in a really unsteady place financially, and it's scary, and you don't know how God is going to provide for you. What does it mean for you to step outside your borders and risk that God will be good to you? Maybe it's in generosity. Maybe it's being more generous than feels comfortable. Maybe you need to risk in a relationship. Is there a relationship that needs mending or is difficult or feels hopeless to you? Maybe it's in loving your neighbor. I know some of you had been involved with World Vision and have described taking risk in being in relationship with someone that you don't share the same language or background. Or maybe it's literally your neighbor, your next door neighbor. Maybe even just saying that made you go, This little graphic I love. This is a pie chart of all the ways that we can love our neighbor and how much time we spend on these things. There's proclaiming the gospel. There's teaching. There's caring for those in need, challenging injustice, protecting creation, and then the largest section, anxiety about talking to other people. Is that you? Is that you? Do you need to take a risk there? Does your faith have borders? Well, I did finish that 5K. And what happened was when I came around that corner and I saw my friend Casey, I first thought, oh, you're so slow, Michelle. He's already finished. And then I noticed he was waving me down the road. You can do it. You're almost there. And I thought, what is he talking about? And I couldn't see that as soon as I got to Casey, the path turned, took a radical left turn, and the finish line was right there. And my lungs were burning and my muscles were hurting, and I thought, I don't think I can do it, until Casey came out and said, Michelle, the finish line is right around the corner. You can do this, and I'm here to run with you. Friends, the writer of Hebrews is our Casey. The writer of Hebrews is coming out to us and saying, there is joy and freedom and a taste of God right around the corner if you are willing to take some steps of risk. If you are willing to say, God, you say you're bigger than what I actually give you credit for in my life. And so I'm going to take a step or two or three that feel a little scary and see what happens. The writer of Hebrews finishes by saying it this way: therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, this pictorial image, this pictorial directory of faith, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus as the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who for the sake of joy set before him endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and has taken a seat at the right hand of the throne of God. Friends, will you risk with me? What will that be for you? Let's pray. God, we thank you that you are who you say you are, that you will do what you say you will do, and that you are faithful. We can consider you faithful, who has promised to be and to do those things. Help us to be risk takers as we live our life of faith with you. Help us to know what is that step of risk you might ask me to take this week. We pray this in your name. Amen.